Please welcome the Henry Ford Technical Fellow for Energy Systems and Sustainability and Head of Ford's Research and Advanced Planning, Dr. Mike Tamor. Is it Tamor or Tamor?
Tamor. Nice to meet you. Yeah. First of all, I'm not the head of research and advanced planning, but I provide sort of overarching strategic advice to research and advanced planning. But first of all, I just want to thank you for this invitation. I note here that the invitation originally went to Bill Ford himself, who was actually very interested in this summit, and he couldn't get here. So obviously, I'm not Bill Ford, but I can carry along some of his messages, which is actually quite relevant to this whole conversation today, in that he is a passionate environmentalist up to the point of being a little bit of concern to the Ford Board of Directors, which is actually a good thing. But he also has an obvious vested interest in the success of the Ford Motor Company for another 100 years. The company celebrated its 100th anniversary in 2003, and one of the questions he started asking in about 2012 was, what does it take for Ford to be relevant or as relevant for another 100 years? So as part of that, let's see, how do I advance here? Is it this one? Yes, okay. So, you know, he started asking that question, and a lot of discussion about it. Many of the trends that were being talked about here, where you get to this sort of a fundamental question, is that, is the personal automobile doomed? It's been a very, what's the right word, very popular and strongly embraced symbol of both wealth, freedom, and individual independence for well over 100 years. But in a world of limited natural resources, the need to reduce greenhouse gases, and global urbanization, all the trends we just heard about, does that actually spell the death of the personal automobile? And in my role as a technical leader, I started out at what was the next grade down, but I guess I've been pretty good about this. We kicked off 3 studies on this question that have been going for some time, and only a couple of aspects of these have actually been published, but the 3 studies were, one, to develop a fairly rich understanding of how personal vehicles are actually used, not how people say they're used based on surveys and internet discussions and things like that, because even surveys of individual owners or drivers are, it turns out, amazingly distorted and inaccurate. One of the key findings to come out of that, which we hear a lot about, is commuting. It turns out that commuting is a very much smaller fraction of automobile usage than is popularly perceived. So all this discussion about sort of an emphasis on commuting as if that's the only reason to drive an automobile in an urban area is a bit misplaced. So the point there is, don't count trips, count passenger miles. The second big study was looking at the evolution of cities. And doing that and working with urban historians and urban planners and universities, I learned a bunch of new words. So who here knows what Marchetti's rule, Zahavi's law, Zepf's law, the 8-minute rule, the 12 per kilometer rule, and the 25-meter rule really are, but those are all important in understanding what's going on. And what I was going to do here is just skip very lightly over some of the top-level findings of these studies, and of course you can grab me outside later to talk about any details. But the first point I want to make here is that a modern automobile is actually amazingly efficient. On a per passenger mile basis, it's actually pretty much as efficient as mass transit. 2 people in a small car are actually commuting together. I just said commuting is not so important, but in this case, commuting together are actually significantly more efficient than taking the train. A family on a long vacation taking their great big SUV is significantly more efficient than if they all flew. And mass transit is actually much less efficient than is popularly perceived, simply because the machinery is so massive. By definition, it has to run empty most of the time, and there's a lot of logistical movement. And then, of course, commercial air has a fairly high load factor, but it's flying an airplane, and holding it up in the sky takes a lot of energy. So if it's not an efficiency question that's going to kill the automobile, is it the urban density question? And here we looked at 2 things. One was a simple history lesson, and that is the moment a new transit mode appears in a city and enough people have enough money to afford using it, the population density of the city collapses. So you see a very distinct difference in characteristic population density between walking cities, and virtually every ancient city was a walking city. And the two big examples of that are Rome and Baghdad, and more recently, like London and Paris of the 18th or 17th centuries. And they had appallingly high population densities because everybody had to walk, live, work, play, you walked. As soon as a faster transportation mode appeared, which for the rich people was horses, of course, but for everybody else was subways and tram cars and trolley cars and things like that, the population densities collapsed. And note here that this is on a logarithmic scale, that the population densities go down. So if you look in the developed world, we see population densities collapsing down into a few thousand per square kilometer. And in the cities that you've seen so many pictures of, you see very much higher densities. But in fact, if you dig beneath the data, the population densities in Chinese and Indian cities is going down as we speak very, very rapidly. So the other lesson from this is the geometry lesson. So it turns out that if you just go through some math, and this is where the 25-meter rule and the 12 per kilometer rule come in, and I'll explain those to anybody who's bored enough out in the hall. But you end up being able to make kind of a very universal chart, which is the one on the bottom right there, which if you plot, you end up being able to compute that a typical developed world level of car ownership is actually entirely viable up to population densities of about 4,000 to 6,000 per square kilometer. And that's actually far higher than in the United States or Western Europe. And it's actually about where Japan and most of Great Britain is today. And if you look at the graphic there, it seems the prediction seems to be borne out that you have to get up to places like Taiwan, Singapore, and amazingly enough, Korea has amazingly highly dense cities that you fall off of this line. So the message is that yes, populations of cities are exploding, and yes, they're growing wealthier and more people are buying cars. But in fact, if historic trends continue, and it appears that they are, cities will spread out so much faster than they grow in population that the personal automobile does remain viable, which is by itself a pretty interesting piece of news. That doesn't mean that the personal automobile won't change over time, and that doesn't mean you can't make life better. So there's a lot of ways to make an automobile world more comfortable and more efficient, and that's the type of thing we've just been talking about, because traffic management is essential. Anything that gets cars off the street and not looking for parking spaces would be a big help. So that leads to the Ford blueprint for mobility, which isn't really what I'm going to talk about here, but it's sort of a three-phase process of moving the company from just providing this one type of mobility tool to being able to deliver and participate in a more complete mobility experience. But more importantly, if the personal automobile is to survive, and we just said it's no more or less efficient than any other transportation mode, we have to go all the way back upstream and start thinking about energy. So we simply, and somebody said this earlier, you can't just go on releasing back into the atmosphere the carbon that nature has been busy sequestering for the last few million years. And we can't afford an ever greater dependence on this finite resource that we call petroleum, which is not really distributed around the world in a particularly fair way. So the message is we have to develop strategies and technologies that bring some sort of energy transformation and bring us to a renewable energy world, but at the same time without, and this was also mentioned earlier, unfairly burdening the economically or resource disadvantaged people or disadvantaged nations. So I was going to spend the last couple minutes here just talking about that. Well, you want renewable fuel. Well, what are the requirements for renewable fuel? Because in the popular discussion, the moment somebody says renewable fuel, everybody picks the molecule, right? We have huge industries that change one molecule into another with pretty decent efficiency. That's really not the relevant question. It's what is the form of the fuel? So what are you looking for? You want very high energy density, you want very rapid refill time, and then one thing that people don't think about very much is both the fuel and the exhaust have to be easy to handle, and you would prefer not to carry the exhaust in the vehicle if you don't have to, which means it really better be a liquid or a gas that's very benign. You want, if it's a chemical fuel, you would really prefer to carry only one reactant on the vehicle rather than several, which means working with oxygen, which means you need something that's been reduced first. And so basically you're looking for atoms that react nicely with oxygen, but leave over, some molecule that has atoms that react only with oxygen, that have a nice big exotherm, and leave behind something that's reasonably safe. And as I said, the exhaust has to be non-toxic. So if you take a tour through the periodic table with those rules, there's actually only 2 survivors. Sulfur, interestingly enough, is a near miss. But hydrogen and carbon are really the only atoms that you can use to carry energy in a fuel. People put in oxygen and a little of this and a little of that. Those are there to affect combustion or for providing lubricity and a number of other things. But really, the energy is in the form of the hydrogen and the carbon, and we'll consider electricity for the purpose of discussion. Now, once you rack up the entire fuel chain right down to the wheel's efficiencies, yes, they can be different in efficiency, but those differences in efficiency are really swamped by the differences in practicality. The actual, no, you don't get a liquid or a gas as the exhaust. Okay, so, sure. So basically, there might be moderate differences in efficiencies, but there are immense differences in practicality. That doesn't mean they won't be overcome, but it's a complete system. So the winning fuel is going to be a member of the winning fuel vehicle combination. In other words, the renewable fuel, whatever form it takes, whatever the most compelling form of renewable fuel is going to define what the vehicles are. The fuel infrastructure is going to evolve much more slowly than we can change vehicle technologies. The as-built environment takes 60 years to replace. Our products are completely swept off the road in 18 years, and 80% of cars are off the road in about 12 years. So we will react to whatever the right fuel is, but we need to know what that fuel is. So looking forward, when we talk about renewable fuel, we have to go all the way back to the source of energy, and really the renewable fuel debate just becomes an electricity versus plants debate. Solar, wind, hydro, geothermal, and nuclear, which is sort of an honorary renewable in this discussion, the only thing that they can make is electricity. Of course, all electric vehicles are extremely efficient. That was mentioned earlier. But they carry along huge compromises in range, and we can have an interesting discussion about some of the numbers that were mentioned. Refueling time, we can have another discussion about that, and cost, which is another discussion. The plug-in hybrid electric vehicle can actually displace 60 to 80% of the fuel that you would be using at a much more reasonable cost in terms of the miles electrified, but it still needs some fuel. In the sense of an electrically derived fuel, hydrogen is clearly the superior fuel in terms of range and refill time and so on, but it's only about 50% efficient in generator to wheels. On the plant side, cellulose, lignin, and sugars are all nice hydrocarbons that can be converted into hydrocarbon energy carriers. And I hate to use the word biofuel because, again, every time you say that word, everybody thinks of one thing. If you're a diesel person, you think, oh, biodiesel, and you're back to something that you made from seeds or algae. And if you're talking about spark ignited engine, everybody says ethanol. Well, no, all I mean is that it was the carbon atoms in the fuel came from plants instead of a hole in the ground. But there are still big problems with all biofuels that they can be used in existing internal combustion engines, but there's this big controversy about land versus fuel because you need really a lot of biomass. And then I just want to throw on the table one of my favorite subjects just to start conversations is what about electricity and plants instead of or, and that leads to a very interesting subject right now, which is electrofuel, and that is to use fast pyrolysis combined with electrocatalysis, and those are words that I won't argue about because I'm not a chemist, but the idea instead of making a biofuel where you associate fuel with a specific molecule, you make something that you would call biocrude, which then can be fed into the traditional reconfiguration, molecular reconfiguration machine that we call oil refining, to make standard products that can be backwards compatible with existing vehicles, which is really kind of important. And wouldn't it be nice to make a new fuel that could go in all 1 and some small change billion motor vehicles that are in the world today, instead of having to wait for them all to be replaced? You also get over twice the amount of fuel per unit of biomass that you put into it, and that's a low estimate. We think it could actually be quite a bit higher, maybe even up to 4 times. So the way, in this case, you think of the carbon atom as being energy carrier for renewable hydrogen, except that carbon atom also came from the air instead of from the ground. And then someday we could move on to air capture of CO2, and once again, just make anything we want. I'm not picking winners and losers here. We're perfectly happy with renewable hydrogen. If renewable electricity is the only reasonable way to go, we'll deal with that. But there's a lot of appeal to this idea of zero fossil carbon fuel. So with that, I'll just wind up that there's this huge growing interest all over the world in this more integrated industrial approach to production of renewable fuel, rather than mapping specific plants or specific bacteria onto specific molecules. They could be balance of trade, energy security, just pure concern about climate change, or even a desire to develop an export leading set of technologies. And the only comment I'd like to make is that the country that we're sitting in here now is the one place where these things really line up the most exactly of any place that I could think of. And the analogy that comes to mind right away is Israel's leadership in desalination technology, where it was homegrown for very specific domestic strategic purposes, but turned into a very important global export technology. And it would be easy to imagine that the new, sort of much more entrepreneurial startup culture with a lot of smart people here lined up against what's both a very acute local strategic problem, but also one that's shared globally, could make for some really interesting progress and collaborations. And with that, once again, thank you for listening, and I'll be around.